The midday sun beat down on the bustling city streets, casting long shadows and illuminating every crevice with its harsh, unforgiving light. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the alleyway. But amid the chaos, there was one man sitting motionless, a faint smile playing on his lips despite the roughness of his surroundings. He was an older man, hunched and weathered, his clothes frayed and worn. To the average passerby, he looked like nothing more than another homeless soul lost to the world, invisible to the people who hurried past. But then there was her. Tasha Williams, 28, tall, with striking dark skin and eyes that held the stories of resilience and perseverance, walked briskly down the same alley, her mind preoccupied with the tasks of the day. She worked tirelessly as an administrative assistant at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, known for its strict protocols and high standards. Every moment of her life felt measured, every step deliberate. She had learned long ago that in order to succeed in a world that often overlooked her, she had to work twice as hard, be twice as good. As she neared the old man, something in her gut stirred, a quiet, subtle pull. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment their gazes locked. Something in his eyes felt familiar, a strange recognition she couldn't place. The man's hand shook as he held out a small cup, asking for spare change in a voice that was barely more than a rasp. Tasha hesitated. She had seen the countless faces of the homeless before, had walked past them, ignored them, justified it in her mind as just a part of city life. But today felt different. Something tugged at her heart, compelling her to stop. Without thinking twice, Tasha pulled a crumpled bill from her pocket and placed it in his cup. She didn't stop there. She knelt down, asking him if he needed anything else: food, warmth, a place to rest for a while. "Thank you, child," the old man said softly, his voice full of gratitude. "But kindness is the one thing that keeps the world going." Tasha smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was a small gesture, nothing grand, but it felt right. As she straightened up to leave, the old man's voice called out to her again. "You have a good heart, girl. Never let them take that from you." She nodded, about to continue on her way when she heard the unmistakable voice of her manager, Richard Miller, calling from the far end of the alley. "Tasha, what the hell are you doing?" His voice was sharp, filled with disgust. "This isn't the time or place for this. Get back to work." Tasha stood up quickly, dusting herself off. Richard, the firm's managing partner, had always been cold, never one for understanding or compassion. She had grown used to his harsh criticisms, his cold stares. But today, something felt different. His presence felt suffocating, an authority demanding obedience no matter the cost. "I was just helping him, Richard," Tasha said calmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "He's a human being." "Human being?" Richard scoffed, his face contorting in contempt. "You're wasting your time, Tasha. Helping a homeless man on company time? You're a disgrace. Do you know what this will do to the company's reputation? Get back to the office right now. You're lucky I'm not firing you on the spot for this." Tasha's heart sank. She had expected the reprimand, but not the anger in his eyes, not the disdain with which he regarded her humanity. Her hands clenched into fists, but she nodded and began to walk back towards the office. The words stung, but she couldn't let them break her. Not today. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the old man wasn't just any homeless person. He was someone important, someone with a vast fortune, and a story far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Tasha had just made the one decision that would change her life forever. And Richard Miller had just made the one mistake that would cost him everything. Tasha Williams wasn't new to struggle. Born and raised in the tight-knit, yet often unforgiving corners of the city, she learned early that survival was a daily negotiation. Her mother, a single parent, worked double shifts as a nurse to keep the family afloat, her father long gone from their lives. Tasha had been raised on resilience, on fighting to be seen in a world that didn't always notice her. Her job as an administrative assistant at Foster & Whitfield, one of the city's top law firms, was a step up, a door to the future she dreamed of since childhood. The job came with its perks: an office in a sleek glass tower, access to high-profile clients, a salary that helped her keep the lights on and the rent paid. But despite all of this, there was a constant undercurrent of inequality that ran through every part of her existence at the firm. She wasn't just a token employee, but she often felt like she was treated as such. Every day, she was reminded that she was working in a world built for people who didn't look like her. The microaggressions came at her from every direction: subtle remarks about her hair, dismissive glances when she spoke in meetings, the quiet exclusion from the firm's after-work drinks. She'd learned to push it all down, to smile, and keep moving forward. She had to, but it was exhausting. Richard Miller, the firm's managing partner, was one of the chief architects of that exhaustion. In his late 40s, Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, and always impeccably dressed. On the surface, he was everything the firm wanted: sharp, confident, always in control. His authoritative voice commanded respect. But there was something else about him that Tasha had noticed from day one: his inability to truly see people, to understand the complexities of their lives beyond what served him. He never acknowledged her contributions, always focusing on her mistakes. The way he would subtly belittle her in meetings, the way he made her feel small, inconsequential, his casual disregard for her worth. Richard's role was to maintain the firm's image, and he was fiercely protective of it, even when it meant running over people like Tasha in the process. Tasha was used to it. She learned to brace herself for the sharp words, the unspoken judgments, and the cold distance. But it didn't stop the ache in her chest, the ever-present reminder that no matter how hard she worked, how much she gave, it would never be enough in a world where she was always going to be less than. Yet outside of the firm's towering walls, Tasha had a life that mattered, real relationships with people who valued her for who she was. Her best friend, Lena, worked as a nurse and often reminded her that the corporate world wasn't everything. "Tasha, you're doing just fine. Don't let them make you feel like you're not enough," Lena would say, squeezing her hand after long shifts, eyes full of understanding. Lena was one of the few people Tasha could count on, someone who always saw her as more than the job she held. Tasha had worked hard to get to this point, but the road hadn't been easy. There were days when she felt like giving up, days when she wondered if all her sacrifices would ever be enough. But every time those thoughts crept in, she pushed them aside, focused on the goal: to make something of herself, to prove to the world, and to herself, that she was more than the circumstances she'd been born into. On this particular day, the weight of the world seemed to press a little harder. The pressure from Richard, the relentless hours, the ongoing inequality, it all felt like it was starting to break her. She needed a win, a spark to reignite her spirit. That was when the moment with the homeless man occurred. It was small. It was fleeting. But in that instant, when she decided to stop and help him, she felt something shift. The world, for a brief second, wasn't just about what she could give or what was expected of her. It was about her humanity. She had no idea that this small, seemingly insignificant act of kindness would be the catalyst for a chain of events that would unravel everything she had ever known. But the consequences of this moment, the way it would change her life, were already beginning to take shape. And the most surprising part of all, Richard had no idea just how far-reaching his actions would be in the grand scheme of things. The next morning, Tasha's routine was the same as always. She woke up early, dressed in the modest but professional outfit she'd grown accustomed to wearing, and prepared for another day in the firm's high-rise office. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the city as she stepped into the crowded subway. She had her head down, lost in thoughts of the day ahead, but there was a slight weight in her chest, a quiet nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. As she entered the office, the atmosphere felt different. There was an edge to it, a tension she couldn't quite place. She greeted the receptionist, grabbed her coffee, and made her way to her desk, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lena, a simple, "How's everything?" But Tasha didn't have time to respond. She had a meeting with Richard, and she needed to focus. Sitting at her desk, Tasha reviewed her notes for the upcoming meeting, but her mind kept drifting back to the homeless man. She had never done anything like that before, just stopping, taking the time to speak with someone who had nothing. The warmth of that brief connection stayed with her like a tiny spark of hope, and she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the world needed more moments like that. But then the email came in, an invitation to meet Richard in his office. Come to my office at 9 a.m., Tasha. We need to discuss your recent behavior. Her stomach churned. Her heart raced. She knew exactly what this was about. When she entered Richard's office, he was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid, the faintest scowl playing on his lips. The room, as always, was cold, minimalistic with expensive art on the walls and a sleek, imposing desk that made it clear who had the power here. Tasha, Richard's voice was sharp, his gaze cold as he glanced up from his tablet. I want to talk about what happened yesterday. She took a breath, trying to keep herself composed. What do you mean, Richard? You really should know better than to waste company time helping random people on the street, especially when it's a blatant violation of company protocol, he said, voice laced with disdain. You're an employee here, not a charity worker. Do you understand the kind of message you're sending when you stop and waste your time on people like him? What will our clients think if they found out you were out there playing hero instead of working? Tasha swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. It wasn't just his words that stung, it was the lack of understanding, the complete dismissal of her humanity. To Richard, she was just another cog in the machine, a tool to get things done, a name on a payroll. I was just helping someone in need, Tasha said, quietly, struggling to keep her voice steady. I didn't think it would cause any issues. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't just helping someone. You've got no right to make decisions like that for the company. That man was a liability, and you've embarrassed all of us. You'll be lucky if I don't have to report you to HR for this. The words hit her like a slap. It wasn't about the kindness or the need for compassion. It was about optics, appearances. Richard didn't care that she had acted out of a genuine desire to help. He only cared about the firm's image, about how every action was scrutinized under a magnifying glass, and he couldn't allow anyone to break his carefully constructed facade. She stood there in stunned silence, trying to process the weight of what he was saying. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was an ultimatum. Tasha had worked her entire life to get to this point, but it was clear now, no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave, it would never be enough. The rules were rigged. The deck was stacked against her. You're right, Tasha finally said, her voice trembling but firm. Maybe I don't belong here. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her response. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, maybe I don't belong in a place that treats people like that. I'll get my things, she added, her tone wavering slightly as she turned toward the door. No, you don't, Richard snapped, standing up quickly. Don't you even think about quitting. I'll deal with you later. For now, just sit tight. Tasha left the office, the door shutting with a heavy thud behind her. Her body felt like it was moving on autopilot, her mind racing, her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. She couldn't believe what had just happened. One small act of kindness, and now her job was on the line. She sat at her desk in a daze, staring blankly at the screen in front of her, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions crashing through her. How had things escalated this quickly? Was Richard right? Was she just being naive? The rest of the day felt like a blur. She moved through it on autopilot, a shell of the person who had walked into the office that morning. Her thoughts kept returning to the old man, the way he had looked at her, the words he had said. Was he just a homeless man, or was there something more to him? She couldn't shake the feeling that something about that moment had been different. As the afternoon dragged on, Tasha received an unexpected call. It was Lena. Tasha, listen to me, Lena said, her voice urgent. You're not going to believe this, but that man you helped yesterday, he's not just some homeless guy. He's Leonard Hawk, a billionaire who owns a number of major companies in the city. Apparently, he's been doing some low-profile charity work under the radar, but he's known in the industry. I'm telling you, Tasha, that was no accident. Tasha's blood ran cold. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter, the shock of the revelation washing over her in waves. Richard had no idea what he had just done. Tasha's head spun with the weight of Lena's revelation. Leonard Hawk, the billionaire, the philanthropist, the man she had helped without a second thought. It felt surreal. How could someone so powerful, so influential, be sitting in the very streets she walked past every day? How could she have missed it? Her mind raced. She had heard the name before. His companies were among the most successful in the world, and his philanthropic endeavors were legendary. His quiet presence in the city had been the subject of much speculation, but she'd never connected the dots. She had just thought he was another homeless person. The knowledge that she had unknowingly helped a billionaire wasn't what bothered her. What bothered her was the idea that her act of kindness, something so pure and simple, was being used against her. Richard Miller's words echoed in her mind. "You've embarrassed all of us." Her chest tightened as she realized that for Richard, people like her were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was an email from Richard. Subject: urgent, immediate meeting required. It felt like a slap in the face. She wasn't even given a chance to breathe, to process the whirlwind of emotions, and now she was being called to face the very person who was threatening to destroy her career over a single decision. Tasha stood up from her desk, her legs shaky, her thoughts clouded by confusion and anger. She wasn't sure what Richard had planned for her next, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let him get away with it. The meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. She barely had the energy to prepare, but she knew she had no choice. She needed to stand her ground, no matter what came next. When she entered Richard's office that afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable. Richard was sitting at his desk again, his hands steepled together, his face expressionless. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Tasha, have a seat," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His tone was cold, the kind of chill that seemed to settle in the pit of her stomach. Tasha sat down slowly, the silence hanging heavily between them. "I've been thinking about your little stunt yesterday," Richard began, his eyes narrowing. "And frankly, I'm beyond disappointed. Do you realize what you've done? You've jeopardized everything this firm stands for." Tasha's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. "I didn't do anything wrong, Richard," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I helped someone who was in need. That's all." "Don't play the martyr," Richard sneered. "You're not a saint. You're an employee, and employees don't get to make decisions about where our resources go. That man was an embarrassment to the firm. If you had any understanding of how things work around here, you'd know that, but you clearly don't." Tasha bit back the sting of his words. She knew Richard. His focus was always on appearances, never the substance. To him, it wasn't about doing the right thing, it was about protecting the image. The fact that she had stepped outside of that narrow box was something he couldn't tolerate. "You don't get it, Richard," Tasha said, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't help that man because of some grand gesture. I did it because he's a human being. He needed help and I could give it." "Enough," Richard barked, slamming his hand down on the desk. "You're lucky I'm not firing you right here and now. If you had any sense, you'd know that this isn't about what's right, it's about what's good for business. And you've made a huge mistake." Tasha stood up abruptly, the anger rising in her chest. "You're right," she said, her voice cold. "I made a mistake. I thought the firm cared about more than just business. But I guess I was wrong." Richard's eyes flared with annoyance, but Tasha didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her pulse racing. She knew that Richard was going to make an example out of her. She had no doubt that he would do everything in his power to undermine her, to turn the entire situation into her fault. But then, as she walked back to her desk, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Lena. "I heard from a source close to Leonard Hawk. He's furious about what happened yesterday. He's not just a philanthropist, he's been quietly looking into a lot of the city's top companies and their treatment of employees. And from what I hear, he's planning on meeting with some people at the firm. You need to be prepared. This could get big." Tasha froze. Her stomach flipped. If Leonard Hawk was really going to get involved, Things were about to spiral out of control. Richard had no idea what he had just set in motion. If Leonard was as powerful as Lena had said, the very thing Richard feared most was about to come crashing down on him. And Tasha? She wasn't just a bystander anymore. The moment she had chosen to help that man, she had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that would turn the tables on everything she had known. The tension in the office was about to reach a breaking point. The next morning felt different, heavier. Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen, like the calm before a storm. Her body was tired, her mind exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past 24 hours, but she couldn't afford to rest. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. Tasha arrived at the office early, as usual, trying to push the nagging sense of dread out of her mind. Her usual routine felt mechanical. She grabbed her coffee, walked to her desk, and pulled up her email, though her mind kept drifting back to the message from Lena. Leonard Hawk, a billionaire, a man who had power, influence, and the ability to ruin everything Richard had worked so hard to build. Tasha couldn't help but wonder, why would someone like Leonard care? It wasn't like she'd done anything extraordinary. She had simply given a homeless man a moment of dignity. She had acted on impulse, and now it felt like she was at the center of a storm she couldn't control. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from HR. She clicked on it, feeling the weight of anticipation settle in her chest. The subject line read, "Urgent, immediate suspension notice." The email was brief. It informed her that effective immediately, she was suspended from her duties, pending a full investigation into her conduct. The words stung, each one a sharp reminder of how easily someone like Richard could tear her down. She sat there, staring at the screen for what felt like an eternity, the noise of the office swirling around her as if she were underwater. Her phone rang, pulling her from her stupor. It was Lena. "Tasha," Lena said, "urgently, I don't know if you've seen the news, but Leonard Hawk is in the headlines. He's speaking out against corporate greed, and he's specifically mentioning Foster and Whitfield." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen the news. She grabbed her phone and quickly opened the news app. There, on the front page, was a headline that made her stomach flip. "Billionaire Leonard Hawk takes aim at corporate greed. Foster and Whitfield under fire for employee treatment." The article detailed how Leonard had been working in secret to uncover the truth behind the practices of major firms in the city, focusing on how they mistreated their employees, especially people of color. Tasha's heart raced as she read about the ongoing investigation, and how Leonard had personally made it clear that the way Foster and Whitfield treated its workers was unacceptable. The article didn't name her directly, but it didn't need to. Her actions had ignited the firestorm that was now sweeping through the firm. The article quoted Leonard as saying, "I will not stand by while hardworking people are discarded for showing compassion. If companies like Foster and Whitfield continue to dehumanize their employees, they will face the consequences." Tasha's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Richard. Her stomach churned as she answered, her voice tight. "Richard." "Tasha," he said, his voice cold but tight with frustration. "I don't know how you manage this, but you've made things incredibly complicated. You're suspended, and I need you to leave the office. We'll discuss your future here once this blows over. But for now, just stay out of the way." "You're suspending me?" Tasha said, her voice rising with disbelief. "For what? For helping a man in need? You should be focusing on what Leonard Hawk is saying, not trying to cover your tracks." "I'm not having this conversation with you right now," Richard snapped. "You're a liability, Tasha. You've caused damage to this firm. You're no longer part of this team." The line went dead before she could respond. She dropped the phone onto her desk, staring blankly at the screen. The words from Richard echoed in her mind, but they didn't land the way they once had. The fear, the anger, they weren't enough to make her shrink back anymore. For the first time, she realized she didn't need his approval, his validation, or even his job to be worth something. Suddenly, there was a knock at her office door. She looked up, expecting to see another one of her colleagues coming in with more bad news, But when the door opened, it wasn't a coworker standing there. It was Leonard Hawk. His presence in the office was like a shadow that filled the room. He was even more imposing in person than she had imagined. Tall, silver-haired, with an air of quiet authority that immediately demanded attention. But it was his eyes that held her captive. There was something kind, something deeply knowing in his gaze, like he saw straight through her and understood exactly what she was going through. "Ms. Williams," Leonard said, his voice soft but commanding, "I'd like to talk." Tasha stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was Leonard Hawk here? And why was he asking to talk to her? He didn't wait for her to answer. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet thud. "I know about your situation," Leonard continued, "and I also know that what happened to you wasn't right. You acted out of kindness. You did something that no one else in this city had the courage to do." Tasha was speechless. This man, this billionaire she'd helped so unknowingly, had come to her. Not just to reprimand her, but to speak up for her. "I've been following your story," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I've been watching this firm, and what I've seen is nothing short of disgraceful. They've mistreated you, marginalized you for far too long. But now it's time for them to see that their behavior has consequences." Tasha blinked, her throat tight. "What are you saying?" Leonard smiled faintly. "What I'm saying, Ms. Williams, is that I'm offering you a way out. You don't have to stay with Foster and Whitfield. You've already proven you have more integrity than anyone in that building. You've earned a position that you didn't have to beg for. And I'm offering you a chance to lead something new." Tasha's world shifted. Everything she had been afraid of, the loss of her job, the way Richard and the firm had tried to control her, suddenly seemed small compared to the opportunity that Leonard was laying before her. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a lifeline, a chance to rewrite her story on her own terms. Tasha stood there, her mind racing, struggling to process everything that Leonard Hawk was saying. The billionaire was offering her a chance to leave it all behind, the suffocating atmosphere of Foster and Whitfield, the humiliation she had endured, the constant feeling of being looked down upon. But there was more to it than that. This wasn't just an escape. This was a new beginning. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands, her emotions swirling. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Leonard's eyes softened, and for the first time since he'd entered, he leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms with a quiet intensity. "You're right. I don't know you. Not completely. But I've seen enough to know that people like you are rare. You acted out of compassion, and in this world, that's something that's almost gone. What I've also seen is how the system works, how it crushes people like you for doing the right thing. I've spent years building companies, building wealth, and yet I've always felt something was missing. People like you, the ones who are truly good at heart, they're the ones who get overlooked." Tasha was silent, absorbing his words. They felt like a balm to the wounds she hadn't even realized were still open. She had spent so many years fighting, trying to prove she was worthy of a place in the corporate world, trying to silence the voice that told her she was never good enough. Now this man, who had everything she had been taught to aspire to, was telling her that her compassion, her humanity, mattered more than the power plays that defined the world she'd been living in. "I'm offering you a seat at the table, Tasha," Leonard continued, his voice steady. "Not as an assistant, not as someone who's expected to work in the shadows. You'll help me build something new, something that prioritizes people over profit. You'll have a role that's meaningful, a place where you can actually make a difference. No more being a cog in the machine. You'll lead with integrity, and I'll make sure you have the resources to do it." Her head was spinning. This wasn't just an offer. It was a call to action. She had been given a choice to leave behind everything she had known, to start over, and to do something that mattered. But with that came a weight. She would be stepping into an entirely new world, one that didn't have the security of her current job, one that carried its own risks. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonard smiled, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No catch. You've already proven you're willing to stand up for what's right. You've shown the courage to do what others wouldn't. The only question now is whether you want to take control of your own future or continue to play by rules set by people who will never see your worth. Tasha felt the weight of his words like a challenge, but it wasn't an empty one. This wasn't just an opportunity to escape the toxic culture of Foster and Whitfield. It was an opportunity to become the kind of leader she had always dreamed of being. A leader who cared about people, who made decisions based on integrity, not fear of power or reputation. For a moment, she let herself imagine it. What would it be like to walk away from the suffocating corporate culture? What would it feel like to no longer have to prove herself to anyone, to no longer be overlooked? She had always wondered what her life would be like if she didn't have to shrink herself to fit the mold of those around her. Now, Leonard was offering her the chance to live that life. I don't know if I'm ready, Tasha admitted quietly, her voice full of vulnerability. I've worked so hard to get here. I don't know how to leave all of this behind. Leonard took a step closer, his presence comforting but powerful. I understand, he said softly. This isn't about abandoning what you've worked for. It's about creating something better, something that aligns with your values. This firm, he paused, looking her in the eye, Foster and Whitfield doesn't deserve you, Tasha. And if you stay, they will continue to exploit you. If you want to build something that truly changes lives, I'm offering you that chance. Tasha swallowed, the decision weighing heavily on her. For years, she had toiled away in a system that saw her as nothing more than a tool to keep the wheels turning. She had tried so hard to fit into that world, to be accepted, to prove that she belonged. But it was clear now, no matter how hard she worked, the rules would always be stacked against her. Richard, and people like him, would always find ways to diminish her value. She would always be second class in their eyes, no matter how hard she tried. But with Leonard's offer, she had a way out. A way to define success on her own terms. Okay, Tasha said, her voice steady now, her decision made. I'll do it. I'll take the chance. Leonard nodded approvingly, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. Good. We'll start immediately. You won't regret this. Tasha felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally in control of her own destiny. The world she had once thought was a closed-off, rigid place was now open to her. She could create something new, something where integrity, kindness, and hard work mattered more than power and money. But as she looked into Leonard's eyes, she also knew something else. The war wasn't over. Her fight against the system that had oppressed her and others like her was just beginning. But now, for the first time in years, she felt like she had the power to win. Tasha sat in the quiet of her new office, staring at the desk in front of her. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into a completely different world. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with texts on leadership, business ethics, and social justice. There was an air of calm here, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive environment of Foster and Whitfield. She'd only started working with Leonard Hawk a few days ago, but already it felt like she was in a completely new chapter of her life. The firm she was now a part of didn't just talk about change, it embodied it. From the moment she walked through the door, she was treated with respect, with dignity. Every decision Leonard made seemed to have her growth and the growth of the people around him in mind. But she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The fallout from her departure from Foster and Whitfield was inevitable. The firm wasn't going to let her go quietly. Richard Miller, the smug and self-assured managing partner, would be furious. He wouldn't stand for Tasha's defiance, especially now that the media had caught wind of her sudden departure and Leonard Hawk's involvement. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Lena. Have you seen the news yet? Things are getting heated. Foster and Whitfield is under investigation now, officially. This could get really messy. Tasha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She hadn't been paying attention to the media frenzy since Leonard had stepped in, but now that she knew it was all over the news, she understood why the pressure was mounting. Foster and Whitfield wasn't just a law firm, it was a symbol of corporate power and wealth, an institution that had prided itself on keeping things business as usual. Leonard had brought it all to light, showing the world what was hidden beneath the polished surface. And Tasha was at the center of that revelation. Minutes later, her phone rang. It was a call from an unknown number, but something in her gut told her it was Richard. She answered with a steady voice, but her hands were shaking slightly. "Tasha," Richard's voice came through, filled with barely contained anger. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you've ruined everything. This disgraceful act of yours has brought unwanted attention to the firm. You'll regret this." Tasha exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Richard, I don't regret anything. I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that happened. You can blame me all you want, but the truth is, your treatment of me and of others was wrong. It's your choices that caused this. You're an idiot if you think you can get away with this," Richard spat. "The firm will survive this. Hell, it will come out on top. But you're finished. No one's going to trust you. And as for Leonard Hawk, he's only using you to further his own agenda. You've been played, Tasha, and now you're going to pay for it." Tasha remained silent, letting Richard's tirade run its course. She wasn't going to let him rattle her. His words didn't carry the same weight they once had. "Goodbye, Richard," Tasha said, simply before ending the call. She stared at her phone for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. Richard had made it clear he would do everything in his power to destroy her reputation, to paint her as a traitor and a troublemaker. She wasn't naive. She knew how far he would go to protect himself. But she also knew something else. Leonard had made it clear from the start that she wasn't alone. This wasn't just about her. This was about changing the system. And she would not let Richard's spiteful threats scare her into submission. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Leonard. "I've been following the fallout from Foster and Whitfield's PR team. It's a mess, but you're not alone in this. We're in this together. Don't let their threats get to you. You've got my support. Always." Tasha felt a wave of relief wash over her. Leonard's words reminded her that she wasn't facing this battle alone. She had a team now, a group of people who genuinely believed in her and what she stood for. People who were ready to fight back against the system that had oppressed them for so long. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of chaos and revelations. The media scrutiny on Foster and Whitfield intensified as Leonard and his team continued to release information exposing the firm's systemic abuses, both within their treatment of employees and their business practices. It wasn't long before the public started to take notice. Whistleblowers within the firm came forward, some anonymously, others proudly speaking out about the unethical practices they had witnessed. As the investigation grew, it became clear that Foster and Whitfield was on the brink of a major collapse. Richard Miller's days at the firm were numbered. He was publicly lambasted for his treatment of employees, and though he tried to spin the narrative, it was clear that his actions had caught up to him. The firm's top clients began to pull away, unwilling to associate with a business under such public scrutiny. But the true turning point came when Leonard Hawk made a public statement. The actions of Foster and Whitfield are a reflection of a deeper issue within corporate America, an issue where power and greed are prioritized over people. It is time for change. It is time for us to rebuild the system, and I will start with the employees who have been silenced for far too long. Leonard had not only exposed the firm for what it was, but he had turned it into a rallying cry for people who had been oppressed by the very systems that allowed companies like Foster and Whitfield to thrive. For Tasha, the reality of what was happening felt surreal. The small act of kindness she had shown to a homeless man had set in motion a revolution, one that had brought everything crashing down and opened the door to something better. Richard's fall was swift and brutal. The board of directors voted to remove him as managing partner in a closed meeting, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The once cocky leader, who had once held all the power, was now a cautionary tale, a symbol of corporate hubris. He left the firm quietly, his name tarnished, his career ruined. Meanwhile, Tasha found herself at the forefront of the change she had always dreamed of. Leonard offered her a leadership position in the new organization he was building, a company dedicated to putting employees first, where integrity and compassion would be the foundation. Tasha's journey was far from over, but the feeling of powerlessness she had once carried was gone. She had found her voice, and now she had the platform to make sure others could find theirs, too. The weeks that followed were a blur of new beginnings. Tasha was no longer just a worker bee, hidden behind the scenes, trying to survive in a system that didn't value her. She was becoming a leader, someone whose voice could shape the future of the company Leonard had built. And it was a company unlike any other, a company where employees were treated with dignity, where compassion wasn't just encouraged but required. Tasha's new role wasn't without challenges. She had to step into a leadership position that demanded not just management skills, but the ability to inspire and guide people through the transition from the toxic environment of Foster and Whitfield to something new. But Tasha was ready. The fire that had been ignited in her from the moment she stood up to Richard and made the decision to leave the firm had only grown. She knew she wasn't just leading people in a business sense. She was leading a revolution that would transform the way corporate America functioned. But no matter how much progress she made, the scars of her past still lingered. One day, a month after she had joined Leonard's company, she received an invitation to speak at a major business conference on corporate culture. It was an opportunity she never would have imagined before. Her name listed alongside powerful CEOs, industry experts, and public figures. It felt like a dream, but it wasn't just the prestige of being invited that caught her attention. It was the message behind it. She had fought for this. As the day of the conference approached, Tasha found herself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the suit she had carefully picked out. She had never been someone who paid attention to appearance in the way others did. She had always felt like she had to hide a part of herself to fit in. Today, however, she felt like she was finally stepping into the version of herself she had always been meant to be. On the day of the event, as she took her seat at the conference, the energy in the room was palpable. Leaders from major corporations were gathered, dressed in sleek suits and sharp ties, confident in their place in the world. And there at the front of the room stood Tasha. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the voice of the future of corporate America, one that cared about its people, not just the bottom line. When it was her turn to speak, Tasha walked to the stage, heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her, the mixture of curiosity and skepticism. There was no turning back now. As she stood in front of the microphone, she took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of people in front of her. Then, with clarity and confidence, she began. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tasha Williams, and I'm here today to talk about something that many of us in this room have been reluctant to discuss: the way we treat our employees. Too often, we treat people as resources, tools to get the job done. We measure success by profits, by how much we can push our employees to give, and we forget to ask ourselves, are we doing right by the people who make our businesses run?" Her words echoed through the room, and she could feel the tension building as the crowd listened closely. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard someone speak like this, so openly and unapologetically. "I was once part of a system that did just that," Tasha continued. "I worked at a firm where my value was determined by my ability to produce, by my ability to conform to the image of what success looked like. It didn't matter if I was treated fairly, if my voice was heard, or if I was allowed to show up as my full self. What mattered was the bottom line. That's why, when I had the chance to make a choice, to leave that environment and do something better, I took it." Tasha paused, letting her words sink in. She could see a few faces in the audience soften, as if they were starting to understand. "Today, I'm standing here because of a simple decision I made to help someone who had nothing to give me in return. And while that decision cost me my job in a system that didn't value kindness, it also led me to a place where I could finally create change. I'm not just talking about changing corporate policies. I'm talking about changing the way we think about leadership, the way we think about humanity, in the workplace. The room was silent now, the only sound the soft hum of the microphone. Tasha's voice was strong, filled with passion, but also with a quiet humility that made her message resonate. I believe that we can do better. I believe that companies can thrive and treat their employees with respect. That kindness isn't a weakness. That true leadership isn't about controlling others, but empowering them to be their best selves. And that's the kind of company I'm building now. She finished her speech with a simple statement that carried the weight of everything she had just said. We're not just here to make money. We're here to make a difference. And the people who work for us, who make our success possible, deserve nothing less. As she stepped down from the stage, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't the applause that made her heart swell. It was the realization that she had done something few people dared to do. Speak the truth unapologetically in a world that wasn't ready for it. Backstage, Leonard was waiting for her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You've just changed the game." Tasha smiled, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't afraid to stand up for what she believed in. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been overlooked, for everyone who had been told they didn't matter, for everyone who had been silenced. In the months that followed, Tasha's influence continued to grow. Her leadership at Leonard's company became a beacon for other businesses that were beginning to see the benefits of a more human-centered approach to corporate culture. The changes she spearheaded in the company began to inspire others, and soon, Tasha was being recognized not just as an employee, but as a leader, a voice for the people who had been left behind in the corporate world. Her story spread across social media, through interviews, articles, and speeches. She became the face of a new kind of leadership, one that was built on empathy, compassion, and respect for every individual. But what mattered most to Tasha wasn't the recognition, it was the quiet conversations she had with employees who had reached out to thank her. They weren't thanking her for changing their company's policies. They were thanking her for showing them that they mattered, for reminding them that they were more than just their job titles, more than just the work they did. Tasha Williams had finally become the leader she had always dreamed of being. And with Leonard's support, she was only just getting started. The months had passed, and as Tasha looked out over the city from her new office, tall, glass walls that let in the morning light, giving her a panoramic view of the streets she had once walked so hesitantly, she couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The journey that had started with a simple act of kindness, one that had been deemed an error by the very people who had held all the power, had led her here. And now, she had become a symbol of something much larger than herself. Tasha had been appointed the chief of operations at Leonard's company, a position that wasn't just about management. It was about creating real, lasting change in how businesses treated their employees. She had spent countless hours working alongside Leonard and his team to develop policies that would prioritize respect, fairness, and human dignity above profits. It wasn't just lip service, it was real action. They had implemented flexible work schedules, comprehensive mental health support, diversity initiatives, and most importantly, they had built an environment where people were encouraged to speak up, to be seen. But as she looked out the window now, with a sense of quiet pride and reflection, she knew her journey wasn't just about business success or making the right decisions. It was about creating something that would live beyond her, something that would outlast her tenure as the face of change. She was making a lasting impact, but she wanted more. She wanted to change the very fabric of corporate culture. Tasha had always believed that leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions. It was about making the kind of decisions that would leave a legacy for others to follow long after she was gone. That legacy began to take shape one afternoon when she got a message that made her pause. It was from an old colleague, Marissa, someone she had worked with briefly at Foster and Whitfield before everything had come crashing down. Marissa's words were simple, but they hit Tasha deeply. "Tasha, I just wanted to let you know how much your speech at the conference meant to me. I left my job at Foster and Whitfield shortly after hearing you speak. I realized that I didn't have to keep pretending that everything was okay. I found a new role at a company that truly values its employees, and I owe it to you for showing me that there's a better way. Tasha sat back in her chair, letting the weight of those words sink in. She had always hoped that by stepping into this new world, by sharing her truth, she could inspire others to do the same, to find the courage to leave behind toxic environments and step into something better. But to hear it firsthand, to know that her words had made a difference in someone's life, it filled her heart with something she couldn't easily describe. For the first time since she had taken this role, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, a moment of satisfaction. She hadn't just built a business or an empire. She had built a movement. That evening, Tasha attended a small gathering of employees, all gathered to celebrate the progress they had made as a company. Leonard was there, as always, standing at her side. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, a stark contrast to the stiff, corporate dinners she had once attended. This was different. This was a family, a team that supported one another, a place where every person was valued, not for what they could produce, but for who they were. As Tasha mingled with her colleagues, one of the new hires, an employee she had hired personally, approached her hesitantly, holding something in their hand. Tasha smiled warmly, her instinct to connect with people always guiding her. The young woman stepped forward, and Tasha could see her nerves. I just wanted to thank you, the employee said, looking down at the small plaque in her hand. I've never worked at a company that truly cared about its employees. The way you talk about leadership, about putting people first, it's inspired me so much. I don't think I would have ever had the courage to come into this role if I hadn't seen what you've done. And now, well, I just wanted to give you this. She handed Tasha the plaque, a simple one. It read, "Leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge." Tasha Williams. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized the impact her philosophy had made on people until this moment. The words on the plaque weren't just a reminder of what she had built. They were a reflection of everything she stood for. She had become the embodiment of that philosophy. It wasn't about the title or the accolades. It was about people. "Thank you," Tasha said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." The employee smiled, clearly relieved, and walked away, leaving Tasha standing there for a moment. She looked at the plaque in her hands, the words now etched deeply into her heart. It was more than a gift. It was a reminder of the change she had set in motion, the change that would continue long after she left the company. That evening, as she walked back to her apartment, Tasha reflected on how far she had come. From the dark, cold hallways of Foster and Whitfield, from being a faceless employee overlooked and undervalued, to now a leader, a symbol of a new kind of corporate culture. But more than that, she had become someone who had left a lasting impression on the world. Her legacy was no longer just about the policies she had implemented or the success of the company she now ran. Her legacy was the change in mindset that had taken root in the hearts and minds of others. The idea that leadership was about service, not power. That respect for people mattered more than profits. That kindness, even in the smallest of acts, could create a ripple effect that changed lives. As Tasha sat by her window, watching the city's lights twinkle in the distance, she knew one thing for sure. She had done what she set out to do. She had helped people find their voices. She had given them the courage to stand up for themselves, to demand better, and in doing so, she had set the stage for a future where businesses cared for their people, not just their profits. Her journey had only just begun, but she knew now that her story, her legacy, would live on far beyond the walls of any company or any title. And that was enough. The ripple effect of Tasha's leadership and the transformation she was championing began to spread further than she ever expected. At first, it had felt like a quiet revolution, change happening at the grassroots level, one company at a time. But soon, her impact was undeniable. Articles, interviews, and features about her approach to leadership and employee rights began to fill the pages of major business magazines, industry blogs, and even mainstream news outlets. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was becoming the face of a new movement, a movement where human dignity, compassion, and fairness were just as important as profit margins and shareholder dividends. Tasha wasn't just leading her company anymore. She had ignited a conversation across the corporate world, one that was being felt on a global scale. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing a presentation for an upcoming board meeting, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lena. "Tasha, turn on news. Now." Confused, Tasha quickly switched on the television, her eyes scanning the headlines as the anchor's voice filled the room. Breaking news. Corporate culture reform gains momentum. Tasha Williams and Leonard Hawk pioneering change in major businesses. Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she saw her face on the screen alongside Leonard's. They were discussing the movement that had been building around employee rights, and the anchor was highlighting the success stories from companies that had embraced Tasha's vision. The segment was filled with interviews, stories of employees who had transitioned to workplaces that not only value their work, but also their well-being. These stories were powerful, stories of people who had spent years in unhealthy, toxic work environments, only to find hope in something new, in a company that saw them as more than just labor. The segment was followed by a roundtable discussion on how businesses across the world were starting to adopt similar policies. Experts on leadership, ethics, and labor rights weighed in, echoing the changes that were now being implemented in response to Tasha's work. Tasha sat back in her chair, stunned. She had always hoped that the world would respond to her work, but seeing it unfold on a global scale was a humbling, overwhelming experience. Her face had become synonymous with a shift in corporate culture, a shift that was reshaping how businesses operated. And it wasn't just a momentary trend. The conversation had evolved from simple recognition to genuine, widespread action. Later that week, Tasha was invited to speak at a conference in Paris, where business leaders from all over the world were gathering to discuss the future of corporate responsibility. The invitation itself was a testament to how far her message had traveled. To be included in such a forum, to have her voice heard by so many influential figures from across industries was both exciting and intimidating. But it was clear now, Tasha wasn't just pushing for change in one company or one country. The world was paying attention. When she arrived in Paris, she was greeted by a flurry of media requests, interviews, and questions. But Tasha had grown comfortable with the spotlight. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. She was here to make sure that the change she had started wasn't going to be forgotten. Her role as a spokesperson for the movement wasn't just about her personal success. It was about ensuring that the voices of the employees, the ones who had suffered in silence for too long, were finally being heard. During her keynote speech, as she stood before a packed room of global business leaders, Tasha felt a deep sense of responsibility. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the millions of people who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, often in silence, trying to make a living in environments that dehumanize them. This was their moment. This was her chance to remind the world that success in business could and should be defined by how companies treated their people. Leadership, she began, her voice steady, is not about controlling those who work for you. It's about lifting them up. It's about ensuring that every person in your company knows their value, that they are more than just a number on a balance sheet. If you want true success, if you want to build a company that lasts, not just in profits, but in people, you have to start by recognizing the dignity of each individual you employ. The room was silent, listening intently. Tasha could see it in their eyes. They were starting to understand. Some of them, she knew, were uncomfortable with the challenge she presented. But there were others who, like her, were ready for change. They were ready to reshape the future, to take this moment and turn it into a movement that would inspire future generations of business leaders. As Tasha finished her speech, the applause was thunderous. She had said what needed to be said, not just for her company, but for the world. But what happened next surprised her. A panel of CEOs from major companies in the room stood up and, one by one, began to speak about their commitment to adopting similar policies that prioritized employee welfare, mental health, and work-life balance. They spoke candidly about their previous failures to address these issues, but also about their desire to change. The discussion that followed was filled with questions, ideas, and passionate debates, but one thing was clear: Tasha's message had not just sparked a conversation. It had ignited a global movement. The days following the conference were filled with meetings, media interviews, and follow-up discussions with business leaders from across the world. Tasha found herself in demand, invited to conferences, panel discussions, and global think tanks. But as the world responded, she remained grounded. She knew that her work was far from over. It was only just beginning. She didn't want to be the face of a trend. She wanted to build a legacy that would last, a future where compassion and integrity would always be at the heart of business. The movement was now global, but Tasha knew it had to continue growing, evolving, and expanding to reach even more companies, more industries, and more people. Back in her office, surrounded by the busy hum of her colleagues, Tasha reflected on how far she had come. She had started with a single act of kindness, and now she was leading a revolution, one that was being felt in boardrooms and offices around the world. But she also knew that it was more than just her success. It was the success of the many people who had believed in her, supported her, and stood by her from the very beginning. The people who had quietly pushed for change in their own workplaces, who had stood up for what was right just like she had. And as she looked out at the city, now bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, Tasha Williams knew one thing for sure: the world was finally listening. Her legacy was no longer just a dream, it was becoming reality. The world was changing. Tasha could feel it in every conversation, in every handshake, in the hundreds of messages she received each day from people whose lives had been touched by the movement she had helped create. It had started with just a spark, a single act of kindness, and now it had evolved into something that was shaping not just the future of business, but the very way people thought about their worth, their rights, and the world they could build together. But it wasn't just the accolades or the recognition that defined Tasha's success. As she sat in her office, reflecting on the journey she had taken, she realized it was the quiet moments, the personal stories that meant the most. The messages from employees who had finally found the courage to leave toxic workplaces, the thank you notes from parents who could now afford to send their children to college because their company had started to care about their well-being, the stories of people who had once felt invisible but who now felt seen and heard. That was the true measure of success. One quiet evening, as Tasha was leaving the office, she spotted an envelope sitting on her desk. It was simple, unmarked, and had no return address. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat, careful writing. It was a letter dated just a few weeks after her keynote speech in Paris. The letter read, "Dear Tasha, I don't know if you remember me, but I worked with you at Foster and Whitfield. My name is Carla. I was in the legal department and often found myself hidden in the background. After hearing you speak at the conference, I knew I couldn't stay where I was anymore. I didn't have the courage to speak out before, but your words gave me the strength to leave. I'm not sure where the road will take me, but I wanted you to know that you changed my life. I'm grateful for everything you've done, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't matter. Thank you, Carla." Tasha sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Carla's words settling over her like a gentle wave. Her chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. It was moments like these, moments where the ripple of her actions had reached someone so deeply that made everything worth it. The late nights, the doubts, the challenges, none of it mattered compared to this. She wasn't just changing the system. She was giving people the tools to change their own lives. She had given them the permission to stand up for themselves, to demand respect, to believe in their own worth. Tasha carefully folded the letter, slipping it into her desk drawer, a quiet treasure she would keep with her always. This was why she had fought so hard. This was why she had risked everything to follow her heart, to leave behind the life that had been prescribed for her and build something better. The next day, Tasha walked into the office, her heart full with purpose. She had learned so much in the years since she had made the decision to leave Foster and Whitfield, but there was one truth that remained unwavering. True leadership was not about power. It was about service. It was about elevating others, and Tasha had made it her life's work to show the world that leadership could be defined by compassion, not control. She walked through the halls of the company she had helped build, stopping to chat with employees, ask about their families, about their ideas, about their dreams. It was a space she had helped create, a place where people didn't just work, they thrived. That afternoon, Leonard Hawk asked her to meet him in his office. She walked in the room, finding him sitting at the desk with the same calm, patient smile he always wore. "Tasha," he began, "you've done something extraordinary. But more than that, you've become a symbol. Not just of leadership, but of what's possible when we put people first. I think you know how much your work means to me and to this company. But there's something else I want to say." Tasha raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "I think you're ready for the next step," Leonard said softly. "We've built something incredible here. But now, it's time to take the next leap. There are other companies, other leaders, other industries out there that need to hear your voice. They need you to be their guide. You've built a movement here, Tasha, but it's bigger than just us. It's time for you to take this message into the world on a larger scale." Tasha stared at him for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. It was exactly what she had been afraid of, the responsibility of having her story go beyond her company, beyond her city. But it was also what she had always dreamed of, having the power to inspire global change. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Let's do it." Leonard nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "I knew you would be." As Tasha stepped into the elevator that evening, a sense of calm washed over her. She had spent years doubting herself, questioning whether she was worthy of being a leader. But now she knew. She wasn't just a figurehead. She wasn't just someone in charge of a company. She was someone who had transformed the way people viewed themselves, their worth, and their place in the world. Tasha smiled to herself as the elevator doors closed, the weight of the journey behind her and the excitement of what lay ahead filling her heart. She had given everything to this cause, and in return, it had given her a life she had never imagined. But more importantly, it had given her the peace of knowing that she had made a real difference, not just for herself, but for countless others. And in that moment, Tasha knew that no matter where her journey took her next, she had already built a legacy that would never fade. Sometimes, it's not about changing the world, it's about changing the way we see each other. And once that happens, everything else follows.